Peter Green is a professional soldier. He served in the Australian Army for nearly 30 years. He's a combat engineer. In other words, his unit was responsible for maintaining infrastructure on the battlefield, but also related to peacekeeping, mine clearance, restoration of utilities, such as water, roads, schools, as well as having the obvious soldiery type roles as well. He served in Southwest Africa, and he also served in East Timor as part of peacekeeping forces. He is an officer in the Australian Army Reserve, and he operates out of the Army depot at Adamstown. So not only is he a professional soldier, he's still connected to the armed forces through the Army Reserve.
So I did think about what the doctor was talking about before, and one of the fundamental differences for me over the last 3 decades plus about the differences between waging war and conducting peace operations is quite simple for me. In a war, you tend to make a mess, and in peace operations, you tend to clean up other people's messes. The one common thread for all types of military operations is the impact on people. So when you're making a mess, unfortunately, you tend to have a negative impact on people. And when you're cleaning up a mess or trying to stop a mess getting worse, hopefully you're there to help people. What is it that the warfighting experience that led to the Spirit of Anzac has to offer in peacekeeping? And the answer for me, very simply, for Australians and New Zealand soldiers, is that we actually care about people. You care about your mates, but you also care about the people that you were just fighting as well. And we bring that throughout our military history so that we are quite well suited then when we're trying to clean up a mess or stop a mess from getting worse, that we're there to help people. We're actually pretty skilled at that. My great-grandfather on my mother's side fought during World War I in France, was wounded twice. Both of my grandfathers, on my mother's side and my father's side, served between the wars and then in World War II. And my grandfather on my father's side served in Papua New Guinea. My father served in national service in the 1950s. I really believe in the notion of service, and that he's doing something for the cause of greater good. And whether that's people who help other people down the street, or they volunteer for something like the State Emergency Service, St John's Ambulance, Scouts, all that sort of stuff, where we learn that there are other things out there more important than ourselves, and we commit to doing what we can to assist other people. And I ended up being a combat engineer, as James said. And at the time, I didn't even really understand what they did. But for the last 30 plus years, I've come to understand we're actually really in the business of helping people. We do have a very strong combat focus, and I'll talk about some of that shortly. But most of my career I've spent cleaning up other people's mess. So when it comes to the United Nations and some of the other groups that exist on the planet that try to bring people together in the cause of peace, I really believe in the founding principles. And I've deployed a number of times under the blue UN flag. So we have in Australia a much larger nation building, nation rebuilding role with most of our military operations. And before I get specifically into peacekeeping stuff, it's important to note that one of the largest effects that we had right in the opening stages more recently in Afghanistan was actually reconstruction task forces. So we sent engineers with supporting elements from infantry and the others to go into parts of Afghanistan that had been devastated by their war, to rebuild schools, open marketplaces, rebuild roads and bridges and that sort of thing. And we did that before we actually seriously got into the warfighting part. So some treaties come and go, and I know that focusing on peacekeeping, it is really important to track the progress of the history of the United Nations so that you understand what they're doing today has a very long history of trying to make the world a better place. And I think that you're going to be covering that sort of later on anyway. So within, for example, Southern Africa, sub-equatorial Africa particularly, Southeast Asia, the Southwest Pacific, and also the Middle East, I've been part of quite a number of missions, sometimes UN, sometimes NATO, sometimes other international agreements that have taken me overseas, specifically in uniform, carrying a rifle, in order to do something good. One of the particular responsibilities that engineers have in the battle space is to fundamentally make the way safe for our forces to get from one place to another. So more recently in Afghanistan, you would have seen lots of photos and images and video of people walking the ground out the front of the trucks, trying to clear the path. And that's the role of the sappers, which is what combat engineers get called, sappers. And that skill, it doesn't matter whether you're doing it in a time of war so that our forces can move forward, or, you know, peace is broken out and you're now trying to make an area safe for villagers to move back in, for crops to be grown, that sort of thing. It's the same skill, it's the same thought process of trying to find dangerous things that are out there and get rid of them. So the collective term that they use these days is explosive remnants of war. The acronym is ERW, and that encompasses quite a wide range of things that mostly go back. That could be from landmines, so not the mine where you dig the coal out, but the landmine that blows up when something goes over the top of it, to rockets and mortars that are fired from the ground to another spot somewhere else where they can't usually see, bombs that are dropped out of aircraft, cluster munitions, which is a big bomb that's dropped out of an aircraft that while it's falling through the air splits open and then sends a whole lot more, hundreds if not thousands of smaller bomblets over a much, much wider area. Unfortunately, the world has come to its sense, and most countries these days have banned the use of those because they're pretty awful. Okay, so if you can imagine landmines that normally you'd have to dig a hole and bury it and then cover it over and then try not to set it off as you walk away, one bomb dropped out of one plane can drop thousands of those over a much wider area so much faster. So unfortunately they were seen as quite the weapon of choice quite a while ago, but right around the world we're actually still cleaning up the mess. So there's a particular map that, in particular, I'm going to focus in on some of my talk on the country of Namibia, formerly Southwest Africa, which is this little red bit down here. So I know that there are some countries that are not shaded red. That doesn't mean they don't have any landmines in the ground. It's just that they have a fairly low statistic for how many people have been accidentally killed by leftover landmines. So the ones that were buried here 80 years ago are actually still there. And in places like France, they're actually still finding, France over here of course, they're still finding things buried in the ground that will blow up and kill people from World War I. So it's a fairly frightening statistic for just how many landmines are out there. It's in the millions. And one of the roles we have is wherever we go, we need to make sure that our troops are safe, but we also try and make that part of the world a little bit safer for the people who still live there. So nation rebuilding goes well past trying to remove the threat of ERW. But we need to do that first before we can move into an area safely and try and bring people back in. So we've had quite a number of UN supported, but not necessarily UN led demining activities in places like Mozambique and in Afghanistan, Pakistan on the border in Peshawar. If I can orient myself here, across that area there. For quite a number of years, Australians were going in, getting volunteer locals, training them up on how to clean up their own place, and then gradually building that local capacity to clean up the mess themselves, because unfortunately it's in their backyard. And that has allowed for an increase in agriculture without the risk of dying just because you want to grow crops. And in places like Cambodia, down here, unfortunately the 60s and the 70s were a really turbulent time in Southeast Asia. In Cambodia and southern Vietnam, there were millions of landmines left in the ground, and they're still cleaning them up today. And unfortunately, when it came to low-tech options for replacing feet and hands that have been blown off, Cambodia leads the way. When it comes to high-tech options with robotics, America leads the way. But there are more people missing limbs in Cambodia than pretty much, per capita, than pretty much any country around the world. And that is that from the threat of landmines. And there's a UN mission that ran in Cambodia predominantly through 93, 94, and quite a few of my friends were deployed over there while I was off on other duties in between other missions in dealing with that threat as well. So the specific responsibilities for trying to remove the ERW threat is you've got to understand from our perspective what were the activities of daily living. So it was important, we needed to rebuild schools, but we also needed to work around making sure they had an adequate supply of fresh water, making sure that the roads were safe between home and the school, making sure that they actually didn't spend 4 hours walking to the nearest well to get fresh water, semi-clean fresh water for their family for the day, and therefore there wasn't time to go to school if school had been running. And again, being able to, as a village, grow enough food for them to have breakfast. So the things that we take for granted, a lot of other parts around the world don't get to. Typically in Namibia when we arrived there, the history of that conflict was that after World War II, in fact after every global war, the powers that be drew lines on a map. And it didn't really matter where the tribes people left or which ethnic population was where. The people that won the war just sort of drew some lines and we'll have this bit, you have that bit, and they divided it up, and it didn't necessarily neatly match where people wanted to live. And Namibia was a case of that. So there's quite a number of individual distinct tribes within Namibia, but at the end of World War II, Namibia was given to South Africa. Originally it had been held by the Germans. Of course the Germans lost World War II, so therefore they didn't get to keep Namibia. And it was given as a mandate to South Africa down here to look after. That was pretty good for South Africa because there's a lot of diamond mines and there's a lot of gold mines and there's uranium in the desert in Namibia. So a bunch of sand, a bunch of donkeys and a bunch of goats, a few local tribes and a whole bunch of mineral wealth. So South Africa was pretty happy with that. Now, through the 1970s, South Africa went through a bit of a turbulent time. Anyone hazard a guess as to what they had going on? Apartheid. Has anyone not heard of apartheid? Okay, some silence, nodding yes, no. Okay, apartheid was the design by the South African government to segregate population based on race. So they had black only areas and they had white only areas, not too dissimilar to some parts of the US. So I'm sort of drifting off, pulling landmines out of the ground, but it's important to understand how this stuff came to be. So South Africa is about, 90% black tribes and about 10% white settlers who emanated from either England or the Netherlands. They were Dutch. They've been there a long time, but that's obviously since all changed. So they had apartheid, so the rest of the world stopped talking to South Africa. So the fact that they had an access to uranium, gold and diamonds was pretty handy for them because no one wanted to buy and trade with them unless they wanted gold and diamonds, in which case there was a lot of underhanded trading that went on. So South Africa just did their own thing and they had this issue going on where they used Namibia as a buffer zone between them and Angola. So Angola was the next country due north. It had been in the same way given up to another country sometime after World War II, and somehow the Cubans ended up supporting Angola. So Angola is an African country, and there are tribes of people that live in Angola, but the people in charge were Cuban, from Cuba, way over here somewhere, behind that big circle. Why they were there, I don't know. But it was something to do with the spread of communism across the globe, and they were backed by Russians. So Russians supplied weapons, landmines, aircraft, training to the Cubans, who then in turn controlled Angola, who then provided it to the locals. So South Africa, who was anti-communist, didn't like that. So this country of Namibia provided a very handy buffer zone between the spread of communism from the north and them trying to hold out and just be their own entity from the south. Whether we liked them or not, this is what they were trying to do. So this place was basically a battlefield for about 25 years. And the people who lived there in the middle didn't really have a say. So there were people who lived in Namibia who wanted their own independence, they wanted to be their own country. And eventually that did occur, so yay, but it took a really long time. So in the meantime, a lot of people were part of freedom and independence movements. And of course the South Africans didn't like that because that challenged their access to mineral riches. So those people largely disappeared into the surrounding countries and they hid over the border in Uganda, Botswana, Zimbabwe and places like that, waiting for the day when their country would be liberated and they could come home. A lot of them fled into Angola, got weapons and then came back and waged essentially a guerrilla war in their own country. And this is where that threat of landmines come from, because they're really easy, well they were back then, fortunately not so much now, really easy to get, they're very, very cheap, and they're horrendous. So you can sneak out at night, dig a hole, bury one, and come back, tell all your friends in the village don't go down there, and hopefully none of your friends will get hurt by it, but the next time a South African patrol would go along, they'd go over the top of it, they'd get blown up. So they saw that as a win for them. The thing is that you can't really control, you can't tell everybody, don't go down there. So the art of sneaking about, trying to cause death and destruction for the opposing side went both ways. And the South Africans used mines literally in their hundreds of thousands to protect all of their installations. So every power pole, every major, you know, those great big metal one things with the big high power wires that we have in Australia, every time you saw one of those around that area, there was a circle of landmines buried around the base to stop the terrorists as they saw them coming in and trying to disrupt the power supply. So every building, every camp, all that sort of stuff were protected. Of course, the locals perfected the art of sneaking in and stealing those landmines out of the ground at great risk and then reusing them somewhere else against the South Africans. Like I said, they're very easy to get hold of if you're prepared to undertake a little bit of risk. So in the end, this place was an absolute burial ground for landmines. And so every day the South African troops who were garrisoned here, if you think about your own lives, in South Africa at the time, for about 20-something years, they had conscription. So every single male at the age of 18 went into compulsory 2 years of government service. You either went into the Army, Navy, the Air Force or the Marines, or the police force. And their police force was a lot more like the Army than the friendly constabulary that we have to actually try and help people here in Australia. And in that 2 years, you could be pretty much guaranteed, even though you're conscripted down here and you did your training down here, you're going to spend a whole year up here in Namibia on some sort of garrison duty or fighting against what they saw as the bad guys. So the general population down here were a pretty serious bunch because they had, generations had grown up in a time of war where no one was safe. You always checked underneath your car. You never drove the same path between home and where you were going. There was a whole bunch of lifestyle impacts where life was pretty serious. There wasn't a great deal of fun going about the place. So we, in late 1970s, the UN said enough. Namibia deserves their independence. So in 1978, they established Resolution 435 in the UN headquarters and said, Namibia gets to have an election and the South Africans, you need to leave and we need these people to go about living their own lives. But it took nearly 10 years for the UN force to actually get put together and deploy from literally all over the world into Namibia. And I was part of that back in 1989. And for example, the things that we picked up on when we arrived there was that at night, the terrorists, if you like, would sneak in and dig holes in the road and bury landmines and then cover it up again and then fade away into the night. So the next thing every morning, as soon as the sun came up, so nobody moved, none of the South Africans moved at night. They just went into their camps and they sat there all night, and in the morning, then the first thing they do is there's a string of camps along all the main roads, and every camp had an assigned stretch of the main highway. And every morning they would send people out on foot with trucks behind them, and they would walk with a metal detector looking for landmines that had been laid during the night. And they would go from their start point to their finish point, which would be the start point for the next organisation, and bit by bit, all at the same time, the road would be declared safe for travel. And they would find the mines, they'd blow them up, they'd repair the hole, and then hopefully by about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, they'd give the thumbs up, and then traffic would resume. People would drive to the market, people would go to school, delivery trucks would do whatever it is that they were doing. It's a little bit sparse by comparison to Australia, but that had to happen every single day. And you would never consider driving along a road that had not already been cleared by somebody else. So we arrived in this country and thought, that's probably not a bad thing to do. We weren't quite structured the same, but the other thing is that we didn't have the internet back then. So the people who were hiding in other countries and coming across the border to cause trouble didn't really know that the South Africans, the bad guys as they saw it, were supposed to be leaving. They didn't really know that the UN was here to help, and for them to be able to come home and then give up their arms and actually go about living their normal life, which is what they wanted all along. They just saw another group of essentially white people walking around with guns in uniforms, and they weren't too bothered who we were. They just knew that we weren't really there to be their friends, which is kind of weird, because while we weren't necessarily trying to be their friends, we were there to allow them to have their country back. So it was a little bit of a tense situation. So the basic drill of clearing all those roads in the morning, after a while there was less requirement for that, but I've got to tell you, their craftiness, and you wouldn't think that you could easily pick up a bitumen road like a major highway. They actually figured out how to do that. I won't tell you exactly how they did it, but they figured out with the correct application of some liquids that they were able to get their hands on fairly readily, they were able to loosen the bitumen hardtop, remove that, put great big landmines big enough to blow up whole trucks underneath, and then pack it in very carefully, put the road base and the road surface back in and pat it down, and by the time the sun had come on it, any sign of that, because they had to sort of roll it and smooth it flat, but not too hard obviously. So this is why they used anti-tank mines that need a lot of weight to set it off, not the little ones but the big ones. So you need something as heavy as a truck to go over the top of it, but they would smooth it over so that there was no sign that the bitumen had been dug up during the night. And that's pretty clever. Yeah, I've got to admire that, except for the fact that it's fairly devastating when one of your trucks drives over as well. So searching for not only landmines but all of the other stuff. So all of the shooting that had gone on, all the rockets, the bombs, the mortars, everything else that has explosives in it, not all of it actually works. Quite often they'll fire stuff or they'll throw stuff or they'll drop stuff and it doesn't explode. So it just lays there. And unfortunately, other people then unsuspectingly will come along later on, discover it accidentally and maybe upset it, and then it'll blow up. And so there were continued casualties, and this still happens around the world today, unfortunately. So the people of Namibia, the actual Namibians, were pretty happy because we held the election. They had political parties that they'd formed, and in the end, it was declared a victory. They were able to form their own government, and the UN was able to pack up and go home. So Namibia and the group that was there was called UNTAG, the United Nations Transitional Assistance Group, was probably one of the shortest lived and therefore most successful United Nations missions ever run. So Korea, which was UN, dragged on for years. Cambodia dragged on for about 7 or 8 years. East Timor, I mean you were hearing about East Timor before. That had UN there before Interfet went in 1999, and then when 2000 it changed over to UN, and they were still there under the UN banner until about 2012. So well in excess of 10 years there. So all of these other missions that just dragged on for years, and there are UN peacekeeping monitoring groups around the Middle East that have been there for nearly 70 years, and they're still required. This one, it worked, so everybody packed up and we went home. So Namibia is now running their own country and have been since 1990, and they're pretty happy with that. Interestingly, the freedom that these people enjoyed in Namibia in part, was some of the change of attitude in South Africa that in 1994 led to the release of Nelson Mandela from imprisonment, which in the end was obviously quite an important catalyst for the end of apartheid in South Africa, and they're a very different country today. So the people that actually lived in there, I mentioned there was a number of different tribes. Where we were in the north of the country, in a place called Avambo land, and the Avambo were the local people. They were pretty easygoing generally. They lived in grass huts and tin sheds mostly. They didn't really have the opportunity to go and buy stuff, so they would scrounge anything from anywhere that they could. They just needed to in order to survive. So if, not that it rained very often, but if rain was coming in the roof of their shack, they would go around and find something. And when I say find, I mean relocate from somebody else who had it before, in order to repair their roof. And they were pretty resourceful. A little bit of bent wire, and you've all heard of MacGyver, the person who could take a paper clip and some chewing gum and a rubber band and make an aircraft. Well, I think he's got nothing on the kids and their resourcefulness in Namibia. I've seen them just using the wire that you would see in a coat hanger, craft, about this big, a working model car with wheels that turn and axles and a steering rack and all that sort of thing, with a long handle and a steering wheel, so the cart would be on the ground and they could turn their wheel here and the front wheel would turn, and they'd run along and push these things. That were their toys that they would make themselves, because they obviously couldn't buy toys. And they would get an aluminium can, like an old Coke can or whatever, and that was their musical instrument. And in fact, I think we've got some footage there. That was that point that we've probably come to. So there's a video that was made after, while we were there, and was produced afterwards. And yeah, can you just play from that point?
Yeah.
The Australian contingent built and operated a water point to provide uncontaminated water.
There was kids everywhere. Initially they were really shy. This guy's playing a tin can.
One of the country's greatest assets, like any nation, is its...
They just strum their fingers on the side of an empty aluminium can. And like kids anyway, they want to be idiots in front of the camera as well. And they seek amusement wherever they can get it. And if somebody else isn't amusing them, they'll amuse themselves. And one of the roles that the kids had was to look after the animals of the village. And they lived in what they called kraals, so it had basically a bunch of sticks in a fence and then some sort of rough structured huts inside that. And Namibia as a country is around about the size of New South Wales, and there was around about 5 million donkeys and there was about 15 million goats. I have no idea why they had so many goats and donkeys, because they didn't milk them and they didn't use them as beasts of burden. They didn't use them to farm, or they didn't use them to carry anything. They were a sign of wealth. So the more goats and donkeys that your village owned, the wealthier you were. Like I said, they didn't eat them and they didn't work them, so I really don't actually understand, other than a bartering system, what value they had. But the more you had, the richer you were. I know that they did use them, for example, if your daughter wanted to marry the son from another village, you would have to make an arrangement with so many goats and so many donkeys as a gift with your daughter to the other village in order to cement the marriage. It was called a dowry. And again, so they did have some value. Again, I don't know what the actual value was. So there was a lot of goats and a lot of donkeys, and I'm sure that later on you'll get to review the whole video yourself. It's actually available on YouTube anyway. But one of the roles of the kids was to look after the animals of the village. And such was their skill that they'd grown up with it. As soon as they could walk or toddle, they were put out with the animals. And their job was to keep the animals safe, because the animals were actually worth more than the kids were, technically, because human life in a lot of places like that is fairly cheap. So if one of the goats wandered off into an area where it shouldn't be, the kid had better go and get that goat back, because otherwise, they were in for a whooping later on at home with dad. And such was their skill that they knew the footprint, or the hoof print if you like, of every animal in their herd. So if one of their goats, I don't know if they named them or just numbered them or they just knew what they looked like, but if one of their goats wandered off, they knew which one it was and they could track it to find out where it had gone. And I've seen tracking animals before, but nothing on a scale of this. I'm talking kids of 6, 7 and 8 years of age being able to track the different footprints of something like 50 different individual animals within their village herd. And it was pretty important though. You didn't want to get in trouble for losing the prize donkey or whatever it was. So the Ovambo were fairly laid back. They're also quite political. Further to the north there was another tribe called the Himba, and again you'll see footage of that in the video when you look at it yourself. But they're quite a antiquated tribe, I suppose. They didn't really wear much in the way of clothing, and they smeared a mixture of blood and fat onto their skin with a bit of dirt, and it was actually for sun protection, and they thought it made them look nice as well. Unfortunately, a little bit on the nose once the sun hits that mixture of sort of congealed fat and blood, animal blood that was, and they were a pretty fairly primitive approach. But again, they would tend to, over the past 25 years, stay away from any white person who turned up with a gun. That was just a good safety measure. And so when we turned up, they just behaved the same. So they're quite reclusive as well, and it took a little while for us to try and establish any sort of rapport, because before we would move into their area, we needed to establish contact with them and let them know who we were, because that's how we operate, because we don't just barge into places. Unfortunately, the predecessors hadn't done that, and so it took a little while for us to establish that rapport. So the children were lively if given the opportunity, but they had grown up in a really, really serious time before that, so they greatly celebrated the freedoms that came with the Declaration of Independence. Their living conditions were very, very harsh. These kids have clothes, and you saw them mucking around on a donkey there before, inside a fence and that. Not far from there were other people from, I suppose, other villages who generally lived in what we would call the rubbish tip. So each of the occupying forces that had been there generates rubbish. It's a first world problem. We all generate rubbish. Everybody has a hard rubbish day twice a year. Everybody puts their wheelie bin out once a week. That stuff goes somewhere. So for many, many years, this rubbish had been chucked in trucks, taken out somewhere and dumped. And there were people who lived in the tip because they didn't have any food, and they didn't have any clothing, and they didn't have anything other than what they could scrounge from the tip. So for me, coming from Australia as a 21-year-old, to arrive in Africa and see and in fact, if you wanted to skip on the video to just after that actually, 25, 24.
And threat of attack, the heat and hard work. Their time in Namibia was also a first-hand experience of desperate poverty, hunger and need.
Polystyrene. Not really too sure what nutritional value you saw in this. Now the crew that went over from Australia to film this, obviously they realised the sensitivities of people back home as well. So there were probably some worse circumstances than this that they didn't film because they kind of figured it would never actually make it on the video later on. And you'll see a child in a moment quite happily scoring somebody else's leftover crappy piece of orange that was probably thrown in the bin a day or two before, and he's quite happily tucking into that. And I've got to say, some of the sites...
For some, the need for food, scraps, clothing and basic building materials was so urgent.
And in fact, these kids were pretty efficient too. So they would actually leap onto the truck while you were driving in so they could get the good stuff. And then they would pass it down. There's a bit of a hierarchy as well. They'd pass it down and they would look after, so the younger kids were being looked after as well. So they did have I suppose, their internal care system. But in the end, they didn't even often need to raise the dump truck to tip the rubbish out, because the kids would get in there quick enough before they even stopped the truck.
Australians were so
They
happy.
would,
A church service at Mariabrund.
yeah, they would strip the back of that truck out, no problems at all. In fact, if you threw a broom up there afterwards, they'd probably sweep it up for you as well. So they were pretty efficient, and it's a really weird way to look at it, but they were actually quite grateful of the fact that we were giving them scraps. In the end, rubbish needs to be disposed of somewhere. And I've got to say that, sadly, what I saw in Namibia in 1989, I saw replicated in East Timor in 2003. And not too dissimilar in other places around the world as well. So it's not something that, it's not ancient history, it still goes on. And I'm pretty sure that if you looked up in a lot of places like India and that sort of stuff as well, that you'll see that sort of thing still going on. So, having lived there for 6 months and then coming home, what I found was, for example, the equivalent of going into Charlestown Square or Westfield, Katara, literally having driven to the airport in a truck, flown back to Australia, handed my rifle in, put on jeans and a t-shirt, got in a taxi, and then gone home, got in my car and driven down to the local shops. It was in Melbourne at the time, but wandering around somewhere like Westfield, Katara, and just looking at everybody else, it was really difficult for me and pretty much everybody else who'd been over there with me to relate that to what we'd just seen. The fact that the majority of people, if not all of them around us, literally had no idea that there were people sharing the same planet that didn't live like that. They were just completely unaware. And the struggles for many of us actually came where we tried to explain that, what we'd seen, and explain why we were upset, because they would be, there'd be a person at the shops getting upset at the latest music CD. I know you don't even probably know what CDs are these days. You might see it. But you'd go to the music stop and you'd flick through the latest records or whatever, and somebody would be complaining because they couldn't get a copy of something, and you'd be standing next to them just in awe of their ignorance, basically, and their sheer arrogance that they should be able to get whatever they wanted because they lived in Australia. And that was kind of difficult to deal with. So for me, as a bit of a takeaway, having spent time in a fairly high threat environment, going out and finding things that would kill other people, uncovering them and then destroying them by blowing them up, and there's plenty of video footage and loose photos in the stuff that I've provided there as well. And I won't sort of go through that now, but you will have the opportunity to review that. It's really dangerous work, but it was really vital work in order for these people to be able to get back to some sort of normal life in their own country. So when I reflect on, I know you're working towards a preparation for a remembrance service for Anzac Day. You're looking at commemorating service and trying to sort of understand that. And for me, a lot of people complain that I have to. I have to go to school, or I have to go to the shops with mum, or I have to, help my dad wash the car or mow the lawns, or whatever the various things are that we in the first world find to complain about. So I often have heard in my own house with my own 2 kids who are now in their 20s, I have to. They didn't necessarily say it to me, but they would say it to their friends because I was making them do something. I have to go to guides. I've got to go and play tennis. They paid for the damn tennis lessons, and they're making me go with it. I don't even want to go to tennis. And I really honestly believe that as a society we need to flip that around and use the phrase I get to. Because we have, obviously, opportunities that so many other people around the world don't get. And this is, for me, the essence of nation building, nation rebuilding, of peacekeeping, peacemaking, is giving people the opportunity to do stuff so that they get to. So when I reflect on things, which I probably do far too much, I do try and stop myself from saying I have to, and I realise, and even coming here, someone else might have said, I have to go and talk to a bunch of school kids today. It's like, this is great because I get to share this with you. And I hope that that's also an approach that you can take in sharing that message so that other people around the world get to as well. So just in wrapping up, This was the first United Nations major troop contribution that Australia made since the end of the Vietnam War. So it was nearly 20 years after the end of the Vietnam War. We had nearly 2 decades of peace, if you like, through the Cold War. And then they picked up a whole unit and they sent them over to Africa as part of this UN force. And the great majority of people had no idea. It wasn't in the press. Wasn't really, it was reported a little bit. It was a bit of a byline, you know, one of those streamers that runs across the bottom of the screen on the TV. Obviously our families were concerned about us going away, but the majority of people had no idea. And then they rotated and there was another group that replaced the first group. And then a year later, you know, people came home and everyone was really happy with the job, but people back here in Australia had no idea. 1993, Cambodia. 94, Rwanda. You had the stuff in Pakistan, you had the stuff in Mozambique. Then obviously, more famously, East Timor, from sort of 99 through to almost the present day. Fire monitoring groups in places like Lebanon, Syria, between Egypt and Israel. There are so many military operations under the guise of peace, and all in the service of peace. So despite the fact that we've been, you know, at peace for a long time, up until the whole situation in the Middle East kicked off, it hasn't really been peaceful at all. And bearing in mind that they only send people off in the service of peace when there is a mess to clean up. So somebody else has been in difficulty and somebody else needs help. And that's why we've been sent.
Can you explain why it's in the service of peace and the etymology of that?
Yeah, so generally when people in the military deploy on an operation, there is some sort of recognition of service medal that they are presented at the end of the trip. And certainly each UN mission, military mission that's been overseas, they have a United Nations medal, and each ribbon, the coloured bit of cloth that it hangs off, is unique to the area. So the ribbon for Namibia was 2 broad strips of sand with the light blue, the UN background, and then the 2 bands of sand for the Kalahari Desert and the Namib Desert, which are the 2 predominant deserts in Namibia, and then all of the colours of the Olympic rings in stripes down the centre. And each different UN has a different ribbon, but the medal is the same. And on the front of it is the United Nations crest, and on the back are the words, "in the service of peace." So it doesn't matter whether it's peacekeeping or peacemaking, peace monitoring, or any of that stuff in between, it's all efforts in the service of peace.